Years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord was crucified, knowing not it was for me he died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. By God's word at last my sin I learned, then I trembled at the law I'd spurn, till my guilty soul imploring turned to Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Now I give to Jesus everything. Now I gladly own him as my King. Now my raptured soul can only sing of Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Oh, the love that drew salvation's plan, oh, the grace that brought it down to man, oh, the mighty gulf that God did span at Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary.
Remind you that the king on the throne at this time was Ahab, and alongside of him was that, as it has been described by one commentator, the serpent beside the throne, that woman Jezebel, that wicked domineering woman Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon, one of the Phoenician city-states to the north of Israel, to the north of Judah there on the coast. Now, if you read that story, you'll discover that Elijah appeared with startling suddenness and confronted King Ahab and told him, in effect, there's not going to be any rain until I command it again. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, Elijah disappeared. In fact, although Ahab searched high and low for him, almost overturned every stone to try to find him, it was as though Elijah had dropped, I should have said Ahab tried to find him, Elijah had dropped out of sight completely. He might have dropped off the face of the earth for all that the king of Israel could make out. That's Elijah disappearing. Now, the drought, according to the word of Elijah, lasted for 3.5 years. And then Elijah reappeared again. And although Ahab had not given up the search for him, because he'd searched all the neighboring nations to see if he happened to be there, and even when they told him that Elijah was not in their territory, he demanded that they confirm that by the taking of an oath. He was absolutely determined to try to find this man of God. But Elijah presented himself, or at least he sent a message to Ahab, telling Ahab where he might meet him. And the two men came face to face. Now there, Elijah proposed this hardly contest between himself and the prophets of Baal, because in reality it was a contest between the God whom Jezebel supported and the God whom Elijah supported. It was a contest between Jehovah and Baal, the god of Sidon. Now, let me point out, in the beginning, it doesn't seem as if Jezebel had the intention of persecuting the people of God or persecuting the prophets of God. It seems as if she had the idea that the worship of Jehovah and the worship of Baal, her native god, could exist side by side. In other words, she was proposing what's called by the theologians a kind of syncretic religion, where you have two religions existing side by side. She believed there could be no conflict between the two religions. And it was only when the people of God in Israel determined that that was something they could not tolerate and they would not support, that she turned nasty and resorted to persecution and eventually to execution. So, the contest is proposed. Let there be a challenge. Let the God who answers by fire be the God. And this meeting is to take place on Mount Carmel, that limestone ridge to the north of their territory, which overlooks the port of Haifa today, a very dramatic place. And on the one hand, you must envisage the king, King Ahab, that weak-willed kind of fellow, that spineless fellow, and the 450 false prophets of Baal, and the 400 other prophets who were, let's say, Jezebel's tame prophets who ate at her table. Sometimes we seem to think there were only 450 prophets there. There were not. There were 850 prophets involved in this. Jezebel wasn't there. It becomes evident if you read the beginning of chapter 19, because her husband had to go to tell her what had happened. She probably disdained to have anything to do with that kind of contest. But Elijah challenged, and Ahab was quite content to see what was going to happen. I don't think he would have agreed if he'd known what was going to happen. But nevertheless, on the one hand, you must envisage this weak king and the 450 prophets of Baal. On the other hand, the people of God called together by the king at the request of Elijah. And there in the middle, this solitary man, this man Elijah, whose very name indicated his faith. Jehovah is God. That's what Elijah means. Now, as I said, the event that is recorded there is found, the event that follows is recorded in chapter 18. And it's, I believe, among the most, it certainly excites me, one of the most thrilling stories that you read of in the Old Testament. And it's an event which, at least for a time, was a victory for the truth and which prevented the spread of idolatry in the nation of Israel. Now, before the action really began, Elijah addressed his countrymen, the people of Israel. Didn't speak to the king, didn't speak to the representatives of Baal, but to Israel, who for a time had been allowing themselves to be led into the worship of these false gods, who'd been compromising, because that's really the word that we're looking for, compromising by following the religion of Baal and the religion of Jehovah at the same time. Now, what Elijah had to say to them was very blunt and very much to the point, typical of the man's entire character. He has a practical proposition to put to them. He says, look, if Jehovah is God, then serve him. If Baal is God, then serve him. At least make up your mind to stand somewhere. Don't go hopping from foot to foot. Don't go swaying from side to side. Make up your mind where you're going to stand. Don't try to keep a foot in both camps, because you can't do it. Now, I want us to think about that challenge tonight, you know. A challenge thrown down so vigorously and so bluntly centuries ago, which I believe comes echoing across the centuries with just as much force today as it did then. In the first place, I want you to notice that Elijah makes this point. There is a clear distinction to be made between God and gods. Between the one true God, who was said to be the God of Israel, and the gods which men had made for themselves, the idols that they were worshipping. He says, listen, there's only one true God, and you have to make up your mind which it is. Now, I suppose that the issue was more clear-cut in those days than it is today. I may be right there, I may be wrong, I don't know. But I'll say this, that in those days, there was no real problem for Israel's neighbors. There were no real problem for the people of Phoenicia. Because, you know, most of the nations all around Israel had no difficulty in adding another god to their pantheon, to their collection of gods. The people of Sidonia would have no difficulty in offering worship to the God of Israel, because they were all happy to add other gods to their own collections. They believed, you see, in polytheism, and they were always happy to worship other gods as well as their own, give them equal status, so to speak. But you know, that's not really what Elijah's going for. He was not prepared to allow the people to think that the God of Israel, Jehovah, was simply a God among the gods. And more than that, it was an insult to Jehovah. He knew very well that God was not prepared to be classified as just one of the other gods, the living God. He says you can't serve Jehovah as though he were just another God like the rest of them. He stands alone. He is the creator. He's not created. He is the creator. And you may not treat him like the rest and bracket him along with Baal and Moloch and Chemosh and all these others. He refuses to be compared or linked with them in any way. He refuses to share your loyalty with them. He stands alone. And there can never be any kind of compromise or conciliation between Jehovah and the God that men have made for themselves. No divided loyalty. That's what Elijah is saying. Now that teaching concerning the uniqueness of the God of Israel is something that runs right through the whole of the Bible, as I'm sure you very well know. He says, for example, in that wonderful passage, Isaiah 40, "To whom then will ye liken me, or shall I be equal, saith the Holy One?" And the answer is, he has no equal. He does stand alone. And that's one of the great truths which Israel, if anybody, ought to have known. They ought to have known that their God was a God who created all things, who stands alone. Indeed, is it not true that at the heart of their religion was that great prayer, the Shema, Shema Israel, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Is it not true that every act of worship began with the reciting of that prayer all down the centuries, and even today among the Jewish people? One Lord. There's no room for compromise here. There's no neutrality. You see, Elijah is saying, secondly, there are some things in life that are always different. For one thing, this God created everything. That's why he's God. Now, sometimes, you know, people ask that foolish question, who made God? The series of television programs, supposedly for children, the scientific programs, I think you mentioned them to me, didn't you, Frank? What was it? Where were they from, those? I couldn't think of the title. I saw this fellow and he annoyed me intensely. He was talking about evolution, trying to teach the children evolution, and then he said, of course, the option is the special creation. But of course he said, who made God? Well, how can an intelligent man ask a question like that? A man who's supposed to be a scientist ask who made God? But there are words that don't belong together. Made and God are incompatible. Oh, I know that there are words that have meanings, but there are certain words that if you put them together, they fly apart immediately. Have you ever heard of a God-fearing atheist? Doesn't make sense, does it? Have you ever heard of a solid balloon? Oh, solid is a good word, balloon's another good word. What about a square triangle? You see, that it doesn't make sense. And to talk about who made God does not make sense. The very word made implies a creator. And obviously, if somebody made the God whom we worship, then that God is not God, but the one who made him is God. And I would think that a man of a supposed education and intelligence would have enough common sense to recognize that. But evidently this learned lecturer didn't see that. Now, the Baals of this world and all the other gods that men worship have been made. They are the work of men's hands, as the Bible points out over and over again. And you see the utter folly, the sheer stupidity, as it's described by both Isaiah and Jeremiah, of a man going into the forest and choosing a tree and cutting it down, and out of half of it cooking his dinner, and out of the rest carving a god for himself, and then when his belly is full, getting down on his knees and worshipping the very thing that he's made. It goes on today, doesn't it, in some countries? How can people be so stupid as to offer worship to the things that their own hands have made. Idols is what Elijah is going to point out. Idols are helpless to do anything or to answer anything. That is the thing that he's going to prove to them there on Mount Carmel. And there's something else too. There are certain things that are irreconcilable. That's what Elijah's saying. Light and darkness, right and wrong, good and evil, truth and error. Why, in their very nature, they're irreconcilable. Oh, I know that sometimes there are clever people in the world today who try to convince you by their sophistry that there are no absolutes, there are no standards, everything is relative, good can be bad, and bad can be good, and right can be wrong, and wrong can be right, and so on. But you know better than that. You know instinctively there is a difference between right and wrong. You know instinctively that there is a God. You don't have to teach a child that God exists. You have to teach a child to be an atheist. Nobody's ever born an atheist. You know there are certain things that are natural and certain things that are against nature. There are things that are eternally and diametrically opposed to each other, and try as men may to combine them, they simply will not combine. You cannot mix oil and water together because their nature is different. Now, Israel's trouble then, at the time of Elijah, is that they were trying to mix the unmixable, to reconcile the irreconcilable, to bring together the one true living God with the dead gods that men had made. And so, that chapter 18, read it again when you get home, is a call to a choice. He demands that a choice be made. Now, let's understand quite clearly what the issue is as it faces us today. I think even today, you and I are faced with the necessity of making a choice between truth and falsehood, between Jehovah and Baal, between God and the world. Now, I know this isn't popular either. I know there are people who say, well, I'm not interested in making a choice. I choose not to choose. Well, you can't do that. You can't choose not to choose when it comes to serving God. You see, the choice is not optional. It's imperative. It's essential. It's inescapable. Doesn't Jesus say that in Matthew 6 and verse 24 in that Sermon on the Mount? Doesn't Jesus say no man can serve two masters? Either he will love the one and hate the other, or he will cling to the one and despise the other. Now, we quote that very often, no man can serve two masters. But you understand what the root of that is. Jesus is not simply saying that you cannot serve God and mammon. He's actually saying you will serve one or the other. It's got to be either God or mammon. And we need to recognize that fact. It's one of the facts of life that every single one of us needs to understand. We are going to serve somebody. The issue is, whom shall we serve? Or as Peter once put it, to whom shall we go? Now, Christians, Christians more so than other people should recognize this. If you're a Christian tonight, it's because there was a moment in your life when you made a choice. You chose God and Jesus and the Bible and the church. You chose heaven and salvation and forgiveness. And having made that choice, it becomes your responsibility to stick to it and never to try to combine things that won't combine. Now, let me be very, very blunt, though very kind and very loving about this. Recently we have been concerned, as you know, I mentioned it the other Lord's Day when I preached, concerned about those brothers and sisters who used to meet with us regularly but who no longer meet with us. It does concern me. And if you look around, if you think, I'm perfectly sure you could name names right now. Young people, older people, experienced, inexperienced, who are no longer with us. Where were they this morning when the Church of God met around the table? Where are they this evening? Why are they absent? Why is it we see so little of them? Why is it that they can neglect the things that are of such vital importance to their spiritual well-being? How can they go back on the promises and the vows they so solemnly made to God? That is the question. Now, I know they may give a whole lot of reasons for this. I know that sometimes the responsibility, or at least part of the responsibility, may lie at the door of some of the regulars, so-called. But I think involved in that is the fact that they may well be trying to mix things that don't mix. They may well, in some instances, be trying to serve God and the world at the same time. And if that is the case, I'll tell you this, the world always wins. God never wins. And if the world's not already won, the world is winning in the lives of some of our brothers and sisters. Now, there's no question that God is getting the second best in the lives of some of those who claim to be Christians today. And that, as I say, really does sadden me. The tragedy is that very often these brothers and sisters don't really see how inconsistent and illogical their position is when they claim to be Christians and yet they neglect Christ. And I'll tell you this, in some instances, though not all, and obviously, I never say never, as they say, not all, but in many cases, if you were to ask them after they were absent from worship for a long, long time, if they still regarded themselves as Christians, and even if they regarded themselves as members of the church, some of them would actually be offended that it even occurred to you to ask that question. Why? They take it for granted, you see, they're still on God's side, even though their lives are not consistent with what they claim to believe. And their lives don't give any evidence of witness for Christ. One moment, they seem to want to be in fellowship with the church, and most of them behave as though they have interest in the church, at times anyway. They want to be regarded as Christians, as members of the body, and yet, look, I'll spell it out for you. If everybody in this congregation were to behave as they behave, there wouldn't be a congregation here. And if anybody should be offended, it's not the ones who over a long period of time have neglected their responsibilities and privileges here. It's the ones who faithfully come here week after week and undertake the work. They're the ones that have the right to feel offended, because they're the ones that are being left to do the work. They're the ones being left to support the work by their gifts, not the people who stay away. I shall never forget that brother that we had over from, well, I won't say where he came from. Came over to Corby years ago, and we helped him from the very start. The church helped him financially. And I will tell you this, in all the time that he lived in Corby, never once did he come to a service, even though we got letters from him asking for his help. On one occasion, I went to him and I spoke to him, and I said, well, we haven't even seen you in worship. But he said, I pray for the church every day. I said, brother, if everybody were like you, there wouldn't be a church in Corby. We could all stay at home and pray for the church. That's not the witness of the church, is it? Now, let me leave that aside. You can see what I'm thinking, and I've dug that hole deep enough. You can finish the rest off for yourself. You know, sometimes I can even have sympathy with those people who never set foot inside a church building, because at least they're not ditherous. They're not trying to have a foot in both camps. They're not trying to hold on to Christ with one hand and something else with the other hand, and face the reality that are members of the church who are being drawn away by the world. The world has an influence. Our brother this morning told us about Satan's influence. He's very much active. Somebody said that Satan's dead. Well, if he's dead, I'd like to know who's running his business for him. Because you can't go very far in the world today without encountering a good deal of devilishness in one form or another. And he does get into the church too. You're right there, Frank. Now, this is the situation that Elijah's trying to deal with. He says, listen, Isn't it time you made up your mind where you intend to take your stand? Why do you continue to hop, go limping between two opinions, the Authorized Version says? It's hopping from one foot to another, like a person who can't make up his mind where he's going to stand. The word sometimes used of a little bird that hops onto one twig, then hops... Have you ever seen a little sparrow hopping onto one branch and for no intelligent reasons that you can understand, hops back to another branch and he's going backwards and forwards on the branches? That's the word that's used. Elijah says, you're like little sparrows hopping about on the tree. Why can't you make up your mind where you're going to stand? He says, don't you see how foolish you are? Don't you see how ridiculous? Have you no convictions? Have you no intelligence? Don't you see what folly this is? Please make up your mind where you intend to stand. If you decide that you're going to find what you want in Baal, then worship Baal. But if you really believe that the God of your fathers is the one true God, then follow your better judgment and find satisfaction there. But at any rate, please make up your mind. And of course, he warns of the danger of their present position. He says they should consider that destiny may overtake them before they've made their decision, if they wait too long. Didn't Jesus talk like that? Didn't Jesus to the church at Laodicea in the Revelation say, you're neither cold nor hot? And because you are neither cold nor hot, I will spew you, but I am about to spew you out of my mouth. He's giving them a warning. He's telling them what inevitably must happen if they don't make up their mind. He said, I wish that you were either cold or hot. But you're neither one thing nor the other. And because of that, you are nauseating to me. And I will spew you out of my mouth. Now, we have life today, but we've no promise of life tomorrow. You see, you can't mortgage your future, can you? You can't hop from one foot to another, hesitating, limping, trying to reconcile the irreconcilable in your life, because destiny may overtake you and settle the matter once for all. Didn't Jesus talk about that man there in Luke chapter 12, the rich man who said, I have much goods, I have much laid up for many years. He talked about my barns, my fields, my property. I don't think there's anything wrong about the man talking about my barns and my fields, because after all, the man had become wealthy because God had blessed the very labor that the man had put in there. He could talk about his barns and his food and all the rest of it, but when he began to talk about his tomorrow, that's when he went wrong. Because he'd no control over the tomorrow. The tomorrow didn't belong to him. For all he knew, he had only this moment. And tomorrow he might be dead. Indeed, God said to him, you foolish man, tonight your soul is required of you. Now, Elijah then calls for this decision. He makes a claim on behalf of God. If God is God, serve him. Now, what he's really telling them is this, that every faith has to be based on conviction, not on opinion. At that moment, they had opinions. There were some who thought that Baal was God, and others who thought that Jehovah was God, and that's why they were going backwards and forwards. No, but you can't do that. Elijah said, listen, you mustn't have opinions, you must have convictions. And conviction is based upon evidence. And the evidence, as far as we are concerned, God has given. Then make up your mind on the basis of the evidence. Well, if you're a Christian tonight, it's because you're convicted that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Your faith's based upon conviction. All down the ages, Christianity has been based on conviction. The members of this congregation have a faith based on conviction. I'm here tonight because of conviction. I'm here tonight because 54 years ago, I made up my mind that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. So I'm not speaking from hearsay. I'm not speaking out of theory. I'm speaking from experience. And you've got to make a decision about Jesus for yourself. Now, I don't know if there's anybody present tonight who's not yet a Christian. But if you are here tonight, and you are not a Christian, it's only because you don't have convictions about Jesus. When you have a conviction, you'll do something about it, because after all, one conviction is worth a ton of opinion. Opinion never saved a single soul. Didn't Naaman have an opinion? Chapter 5 of the very next book, 2 Kings, chapter 5. Naaman had an opinion. He thought that the waters of Damascus were better than all the waters of Israel. And because he had an opinion, he wasn't cleansed of his leprosy. He was only cleansed when he made up his mind to do what God through the prophet commanded him to do. And so it is today. It's not what I think, it's not what you think, it's not what other people think. It's what God says that counts. And the trouble is, as I say, with the Israelites, they had opinions but no convictions. And so Elijah says, now look at the evidence. Weigh up the situation. Arrive at a settled conviction. In the light of the evidence, if Baal is God, then follow him. If Jehovah is God, then follow him. But do make up your mind. Do choose. Now, let me apply this to ourselves today. If the Christian life is the right life, then let's live it. Let's carry it out. If it isn't, and we have the sneaking feeling that the world is better, then let's go to the world. But at least let's make up our mind where we're going to stand. And one final thought here. Elijah points out to these people the urgency of the issue in those two words, how long? Here are people who've been standing at the road junction for long enough. And there are some, I suppose, who attend services who've been hearing the story of Jesus ever since they were children. It's become an old familiar tune to them, and it doesn't move them today as it used to. And if there is anybody in this service tonight in this position, let me just say to you, how long? How much longer? Let me press the point. Let me appeal to your common sense. Let me appeal to your conscience. Let me appeal to all that's good in you. And let me say, how long before you make up your mind that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and needs to become the Savior to take his proper place in your life? These Israelites had had 3 years in which to consider the evidence. For that length of time, the land had seen no rain, as you very well know, because God had withheld it. They'd had this demonstration of the power of God through the prophet Elijah. And now the prophet says, you want more time? You want 10, 15, 20 years? How much longer is it going to take you to make up your mind that Jehovah alone is God, and that his hand is more powerful than that of the gods you've been serving? And so, we need to say to people, well, how many more sermons do you need to hear? How many more Bible studies do you need to have? How many more correspondence courses do you need to fill out? There's some people who seem, as the Bible says, ever to be learning and not able to come to the knowledge of the truth. How many more opportunities do you need before you become a Christian? I remember when I first came to Corby, there was a young man who undoubtedly understood what God required of him. And he told me, well, he would become a Christian after he'd sown his wild oats. Those were his words. Now, you know what he meant, don't you? He sow his wild oats. Well, he didn't become a Christian. He's not a Christian now. And I doubt very seriously if he'll ever become a Christian, because the moment's passed for him. But he's only like a great many other people, and you must have met some of them too. They say, later on, tomorrow, you remember that little line, tomorrow, he promised his conscience, tomorrow I mean to believe. Tomorrow I'll live as I ought to. Tomorrow salvation receive. Tomorrow I'll conquer those habits that keep me from Jesus away. And ever his conscience repeated one word and one only: today. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. The year after year it went on. Tomorrow, 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 till youth like a vision was gone, till age and his passions had written the message of fate on his brow. And out from the shadow came death, with that pitiless syllable: now. Every one of us must make the right choice. To refuse to choose, or to neglect to choose, or to seek to avoid choosing, is to choose wrongly. Jesus once said, after all, he that is not for me is against me. And we have the responsibility to serve as Elijahs. As I say, we have brothers and sisters in this congregation who no longer meet with us, and that ought to make us very unhappy. If it doesn't, there's something wrong with us, and there's something wrong with the church that doesn't feel that. It's our privilege and responsibility to talk to these brothers and sisters and say, where are you going to stand? Do you stand with us or against us? Are you with the Lord or against him? Let's join hands in faithful service for the one who loved us and died for us, that one day when we stand before him, as we all must, he may say, well done, good and, never mind the good bit, because the goodness isn't yours anyway. Faithful, yes, that's your bit. Good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of thy Lord. May God help us to think of this important matter of making up our mind where we intend to stand, because upon the decision we make hangs our eternity.
There was one who was willing to die in my stead, that a soul so unworthy might live. And the path to the cross he was willing to tread, all the sins of my life to forgive. They are nailed to the cross, they are nailed to the cross. Oh, how much he was willing to bear. With what anguish and loss Jesus went to the cross, but he carries my sins with him there. He is tender and loving and patient with me, while he cleanses my heart of its dross. But there's no condemnation, I know I am free, for my sins are all nailed to the cross. They are nailed to the cross, they are nailed to the cross. Oh, how much he was willing to bear. With what anguish and loss Jesus went to the cross, but he carries my sins with him there. I will cling to my Savior and never depart. I will joyfully journey each day, with a song on my lips and a song in my heart, that my sins have been taken away. They are nailed to the cross, they are nailed to the cross. Oh, how much he was willing to bear. With what anguish and loss Jesus went to the cross, but he carried my sins with him there. Days are filled with sorrow and care, hearts are lonely and drear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Cast your care on Jesus today, leave your worry and fear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Troubled soul the Savior can see, every heartache and tear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near.